So essentially, I'm not sure how many of you have heard this news, but a really, really good article by Megan Doyle, who is a journalist that I'm a big fan of, follow her on social media and stuff. But she wrote this article for Vogue Business that talks about how there are jasmine farms supplying Estee Lauder and L'Oréal that are linked to child labor. Now, this article is actually coming off the back of a documentary on BBC. I actually watched it a few hours before coming on the stream, just so I had like better context on to what was said in the documentary, kind of what was shown, what the stats were in the documentary, all that sort of stuff. So essentially, this article goes deep into some of the stats in the documentary, some of the things that were mentioned in the documentary, the regions of Egypt that were used, kind of like the price of things, even the facts, which I'll get into later, kind of the inflation in Egypt and all that sort of stuff. But I think what I have to say about this to start with is, if you guys, for the guys that are subscribed to my Patreon, I've actually, because on my Patreon, I'm reviewing the book by Dana Thomas, How Luxury Lost Its Luster. And in that book, there's a chapter on perfumes. And in that chapter on perfumes, of course, the chapter goes deep into Chanel and kind of, because Chanel No. 5 is one of their most famous fragrances and their most successful fragrance. And of course, Chanel No. 5 is very jasmine heavy. One of the main notes in Chanel No. 5 is jasmine. And in the book, she goes and talks about, how it transitions, how Chanel transitions from sourcing their jasmine from French farms and then, slowly but surely outsourcing to places where they can get jasmine cheaper and cheaper. And of course, it's kind of strange that a lot of these luxury brands, their branding is about, artisans in France and artisans in Italy and in Spain and craftsmanship and blah, blah, blah. But like when you actually look at the supply chain, it's kind of what this article is saying, right? It's very much these brands are using child labor and paying these people cents to work insane hours, insane jobs in like places like Africa, like countries. Specifically, this documentary is focused on Egypt. A lot of jasmine that is used in the perfume industry right now comes from Egypt. So that's what this is focusing on. But if we're talking about fashion in a wider sense, something that I've been talking about recently is this move to cheaper labor market. So, for example, a lot of Chinese fashion execs have been talking about how they've been buying up a lot of brands because they feel like sooner or later, and it's kind of already happened, a lot of brands are going to start producing in countries like Vietnam, or they're going to start producing in places like Cambodia, because the labor market in Cambodia and Vietnam is actually cheaper than China. And because these brands have to keep trying to get even better profit margins, it's only a matter of time before all their production goes away from China and goes to places like Vietnam and Cambodia. And so, yeah, I think that this article and kind of this documentary and kind of this story is kind of just a byproduct of these greedy companies that just have to make more money and will just basically do anything to make more money. Something that really stood out to me, though, in a documentary, something that I found really, really insane is in a documentary, they were talking about how much some of these people get paid to work on the farms. And they were saying that essentially, like, they farm kilos, like they pick kilos of jasmine. And at the end of the day, they might have the equivalent of $1. And they went deep into kind of like, and in this article, I think there's a section where they talk about who sets the price of jasmine, who controls the price, and all this kind of stuff. And the craziest thing to me is these brands raise the prices of their perfumes constantly, right? Like Chanel No. 5, the price goes up gradually all the time. And their reasoning for why the price of, Chanel No. 5 or any fragrance. Let's just talk about Estee Lauder, like L'Oreal, all their brands that they own, all the fragrance lines that they own. They always say, it's inflation. The raw materials are more expensive. Do you know something they mentioned in this documentary that I didn't actually know? I actually assumed that the price of these things would go up do you know that the wages of these people hasn't gone up since? And also the cost of the raw materials haven't gone up. Even with inflation, they've just made sure that they don't pay the people that produce these things more. So you're telling me that even with all the inflation that has happened over so many years, they're still paying the same price for the jasmine in Egypt and increasing the prices and claiming that inflation is the reason why the prices are going up. And considering that obviously that's the reason why their profit margins are getting higher, the fact that they wouldn't just pay these people more money is baffling to me. And I think it's just a symptom of fashion. It reminds me of my magazine, because when I launched my magazine, I paid the writers that wrote for my magazine, I think between £250 to £300 per article. And some of the articles in my magazine were 800 words, which is kind of like the going rate for journalists. And I find it insane that I barely made much money from my magazine, but I did make a profit. That I pay that, and then sometimes you'll write an article for like magazines like ID magazine or like Dazed, and they'll be like, we don't have the money to pay you, so this article will be unpaid, or they won't pay you, or they'll take like months and months to pay you because they have payroll issues. I've never understood that. It's like ID magazine and Days, they have so many sponsors. Like my magazine doesn't even have any sponsor. Like my first issue had no sponsors and I still made a profit. If I make issues in the future and I have sponsors and I do all of that stuff, my profit margins would be so huge. So it would only make sense for me to pay people more money that work on it, and I would still make more money anyway. So I've never understood like magazines or these companies that make all that money, they have massive sponsors, they have huge profit margins, and they just refuse to pay people a livable wage. That kind of corporate greed is something I will never understand. I would never ever understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me how companies in general can just be that greedy. It doesn't make sense. So I need to release the next magazine. I think I've talked in the past why that magazine hasn't come out yet. Um, I go to a bunch of vintage shops in SF. Do you mean San Francisco? SF that makes, because it could be South Florida. I don't know what SF stands for in America, but I'm guessing San Francisco. That make clothes in house. And I realized it was more affordable to get custom garments than buying even secondhand designer pieces, and is more sustainable. Yeah, it's insane. I've talked about this in past live streams, right? But some of the ready to wear stuff by these brands has become so expensive that in some cases you're actually better off buying custom things. I remember in a past live stream we were looking at the prices of Schiaparelli ready to wear, and I was making the case that you could literally go to Savile Row and get custom made garments on Savile Row for a cheaper price than ready to wear in Schiaparelli. And when you get to that point, there's almost no point buying stuff off the rack anymore. It really doesn't make sense. Do they name a fragrance house buyer in a documentary? Yeah, they did name a few fragrance house buyers, actually. They did. But in the documentary, it was kind of like, because there was a section in the documentary where they were saying that they were asking people, can you tell us any companies that buy this stuff? Can you tell us like any brand? And everyone was just like, no, I'm not going to tell you. No, I'm not going to tell you, because there's kind of like a lot of things that would happen to people if they did expose these companies and these brands. So it's crazy. And it's just, when you watch the documentary, it's just shocking the negligence from top to bottom. Because when you think of all these governing bodies, they would ask them questions and be like, what do you think about having underage kids working in these farms? And their response would always be, it's illegal in Egypt to work at a farm, because I think in Egypt, the law is, unless you're 17, there's certain hours that you can't work within the day, but they have 5-year-olds working on these farms illegally, and the governing bodies aren't doing anything about it. The auditors aren't doing anything about it. So from top to bottom, it's just, the whole thing is a total mess. But the reason why I really wanted to talk about it was really, once again, to just expose this kind of like corporate greed, where these brands, once again, They mention craftsmanship and inflation is why the cost is going up, yet literally the cost of raw materials has stayed the same over the course of like the past 10 years. And they have the proof with this documentary, and in this article they go deep into it. So it's actually just really insane. The issue in the matter is evidence, but solving it is far more nuanced than we tend to discuss. I genuinely think one of the solutions isn't that hard. It's just pay these people more, pay them more money. And why I think that's not really a hard thing to do is because we see the billions in profits that these companies make. Like we see it. So if you just pay people a livable wage, if you pay these people a wage where they can actually like survive, you're still not going to make that less your profits aren't going to go down by that much. You already make billions in profit. It's just like instead of making from a $300 bottle, making like, I don't know, $150 in profit, maybe you'll make 120. How about that? Or they could, to be honest, they could actually increase prices. I'm a big fan of fragrances, as most of you know, and I would pay more money for fragrances if I knew that the reason why they're increasing, let's say a fragrance costs $300. If they're like, okay, we're going to sell this fragrance now for $350, but the extra 50 is going to the workers on the jasmine farms, I would happily pay the extra $50 if I knew that's where it was going. But we all know that's never ever where it's going to go. Even if they say that, that's never where it's going to go. So yeah, I don't think the solution is that hard. I don't think it's as hard as like we think. I just think that obviously it's a solution that we'll never reach because corporate greed and brands, they'll just never let that happen. Leo says, I agree, payment is the way forward. But what tends to happen is major corporations work within the lines of UNHRC laws and defer responsibility to middlemen. Yeah, but they defer responsibility to middlemen because they don't want, like, anytime there's like an article like this or a documentary like this that comes out, and in the documentary they did have a statement like that where they'll just be like, you know, oh, well, we don't really deal with it. We deal with middlemen and, independent vendors. So we are not liable. So I think it's more of like a legal thing also. They won't even have to raise the prices that much. It'll probably be negligible to the consumer. Yeah, because to be honest, let's be flipping for real. The kind of customer that buys fragrances for $350 is going to buy a fragrance for $400. Let's just be for real. So if they raise the price and say that the rest of this money is going to go to the workers on jasmine farms, I'm very sure many people would happily pay that. Exactly. Having a middleman is typical fraud behavior. I agree with that. It sucks because you can't even trust stuff like the ethical wool standard because the regulations are so relaxed they don't even mean anything. All it is for most brands is doing some extra paperwork. Exactly. Fragrance prices have gone up so much, even in this era of inflation. So the margin is there if material costs are stagnant. It's not so. Let me be honest. The jasmine has stayed stagnant. It doesn't mean that all of the material cost has been stagnant. The packaging cost, maybe the plastics they use, it has gone up. Maybe I don't know, the paper for the packaging, maybe the cost of other things that they put in fragrances, like the alcohols, things like ISOE Super. Maybe the price of that has gone up. But in terms of the jasmine, which for a lot of fragrances is like one of the main ingredients, that hasn't gone up. So yeah. But even if the cost of packaging has gone up, it's when you're like Estee Lauder or like L'Oreal, you're producing stuff on such a scale. Like it's economies of scale, right? It's like each extra, I don't know, inflation would only account for extra cents per packaging piece, probably. It's definitely not going to be more than that. At like when you're literally making millions and millions of fragrances a year. This is a good point though. Middleman is necessary in some fragrance production because the extracts have to be made within hours/days of harvest. I 100% agree. I think where I think it's kind of like a cop out is you can have a middleman but still be involved. So you can have people where there's a middleman involved, but you have like, I don't know, like a L'Oreal executive or a L'Oreal person who their full-time role is just to go visit these farms and make sure that everything is happening to like regulation standards, if that makes sense. The fact that they don't have a representative doing that means they don't care, is my point. So a middleman is definitely necessary sometimes, but I think in terms of like, do these brands care that kids are working? No, they don't care. So I do think that they could still have someone on ground that actually checks these things. But because they don't care, and because all they care about is profit margins and money, it's something that I don't know if it would change. I don't know if it would. Oh, people are talking about Pharrell Williams, Louis Vuitton. I think even worse is that a lot of times when materials become rarer, companies switch formulations to avoid higher costs. Exactly. Exactly. I hate it when companies reformulate fragrances. Obviously, not every single time when a fragrance is reformulated is it a money thing. Sometimes certain fragrance ingredients get banned, and so they just have to, they're like forced to reformulate. But if we're going to be honest, most of the time that's not the reason why. Most of the time it is a money thing, to be fair. Most of the time it's companies cutting corners. If we're going to be really, really honest, it's not a case of, oh, this got banned, so we have to find a way to synthesize something that smells the exact same as that thing that just got banned. Um, we can kind of play the documentary in the background without any audio. Hopefully, this live stream doesn't get copyrighted, but you can kind of read some of the subtitles. Let me see if I can turn some of the subtitles on so you can kind of get a sense of what was said in the documentary. Micah says, this happened to me. Fenty switched their moisturizer formulation and the new one is arse. Messed my whole game up. Damn. Damn. Micah's a skincare person. I love that. Oh, did someone say the subtitles were on? Okay, cool. Let me turn them off. I remember this scandal also exploded in the 90s with children working, picking up flour for perfumes, and some people excused it by saying they needed small hands to gather. Oh my God. To gather the delicate flowers. Wow, that's insane. We need small hands is crazy. That's a crazy thing to say. That's insane. That's wild. So something also they mentioned in the documentary, which you guys will probably see eventually, is the negative effects on the kids. So some of this work has made it's like messed up some of the kids like eyesight. Some of them have permanent damage in their eyes. Some of them have like respiratory problems. They can't breathe properly because they're literally like developing kids and they're inhaling these like crazy aromas all the time. So yeah, it's just insane. It's just insane. I hate how it's becoming harder and harder to make ethical purchases. At this point, I need to start a farm and make all my clothes and food myself. Yeah, I know. It really is insane. It is sad because I try to be sustainable and I try to do my part. I don't really buy a lot of clothes. If I do buy clothes, I make sure I use it for years and years. I like try to do my part, but even then, it's kind of like because these brands they all lie. So you can't like be like, oh, this brand is like they're really sustainable because they're probably lying, or they're probably saying that they're sustainable, but they're not even involved in the supply chain, so they don't know that to be true. It's kind of like in this documentary, for example, something that was mentioned, kind of going back to the middleman point, is on the L'Oreal and Estee Lauder website, when you scroll and you look at like the sustainability thing, they talk about all the sustainability initiatives and blah, blah, blah. And so when a journalist asked them about stuff on their website, their cop out was, oh, we have middlemen, so it's really hard for us to control the supply chain. So if that's the case, why is that on your website? Delete that section from your website then. Why is that there? If that's just your excuse every single time. Oh, we have middlemen, so we can't follow the supply chain. Then don't put, oh, we're so sustainable and we do all this stuff for human rights on your website. Why is that on your website? Like remove it from your website. The devil wears L'Oreal. That's insane. I think it was also really cool in this documentary how they had this influencer kind of, I think she's a fragrance influencer. She went to Egypt to kind of learn how these things are made, and it was kind of like a like harsh reality sort of thing. And by the way, if you guys want to watch this documentary in your own time, it's literally on YouTube. Just type BBC perfume documentary and it will literally come up. And I would recommend everyone to watch it. It's a really good documentary. It's really touching. Oh, I wonder if there's a petition to demand that brands are ethical or an organization slash designation that confirms certain standards are met. So the funny thing is, it was mentioned in the documentary and it was also mentioned in the article that I just won't read the article because it's actually really long. But it was mentioned that a lot of the governing bodies are having a hard time staying on top of it. So there are actually a lot of governing bodies and like petitions out to make sure that these illegal things aren't happening, but it's just really hard for them to stay on top of it. So something mentioned in the documentary is they need to improve the process that they use to kind of stay on top of these things. That the process that they use right now is really inefficient, which is part of the issue. Yeah, what Rachel said. There is a movement right now for exactly these ethics in perfumery by perfumers called Perfumery Code of Ethics. It's just because there will always be movements and organizations, but there's one thing having a movement and an organization, and it's another thing actually fixing the supply chains, which is the harder part, right? You can spread awareness and stuff, but it's really hard like doing the groundwork. Also, I feel like corporations can just pay their way into a good grade slash review with those organizations. So it would always be iffy to trust them, in my opinion, at least. Yeah, I totally agree. I guess I think it's so people have different philosophies in life, right? I like money. I can imagine that having money is nice. I can imagine it's very nice to be so rich that you don't have to worry about things like rent and bills and stuff like that. But there's like a cutoff point where it just becomes like greed. There's a point where it's just like, okay, you have so much money that you could buy a private jet if you wanted, and you could buy 50 Ferraris, and you could buy 50 mansions. At this point, you have so much money. Why can't the rest of it go to people in your supply chain, like people who are literally being paid $1, people who are literally, like earning lower than a livable wage? I don't understand that level of greed. I don't get it. I genuinely feel like there's a point where you cut it and it's like, okay, past this level of like money, like you just why? So, I like money. I imagine having money is nice. IO 2024. That's funny. That's hilarious. But yeah, I don't get that level of greed. I never understand it. Like if someone was like, Io, we want to give you $10 billion, I would probably like out of 10 billion, that's so much money. Oh my god. I'd like put I'd like buy a house because I don't own a house. I'd like buy a house and then I would like put 500 million into like a hedge fund so I could like live off of the dividends from that. And then the rest of the billions, I'll just like give it to like poor people. I'll just like give it to people that like don't have money, like people that work on these like farms and stuff, like people who are less fortunate. I wouldn't like give them the money. Obviously, that's not like useful. You'd have to like create an ecosystem where they could keep making money. So I'd maybe like send loads of people who are living in poverty to like really good schools and give them an education so they can get like decent jobs, like that sort of stuff. But most of the money, like 95% of it, would go to like those sort of initiatives. So going back to why I'm mentioning this is like, I don't understand having so much money and not caring that there's someone in the supply chain that doesn't have enough money to literally like eat. I don't understand that. I just don't get it. Yeah, obviously a publicly traded company is different because I get it. We're talking about Estee Lauder and like L'Oreal and stuff, but I'm just talking about in general. Of course, when it comes to publicly traded companies, it's a bit different. It's a bit more difficult to kind of navigate that. Um, but I just mean the like greed in general that we see in the world is kind of just really shocking to me. It's hard for me to understand. So when it comes to shareholders, I understand what you're saying in terms of like it's greed, but if they are not greedy, the C-level managers are fired. Yeah, that's very true. That's definitely a reality. It's not really a question of greed. The inertia of capitalism makes it nearly a non-issue. He said, fuck those corporations. Honestly, the wealth and profit accrued by these giants will never justify the level of cruelty and human suffering that exists on a mass scale. I'm 100% with you there. 100% with you on that one. And yeah, exactly. 1 kilo of jasmine is $1.40. I know, right? Micah's crazy. The greed you speak of is why Thanos has to snap away half of reality. Snapping double the resources into existence wouldn't fix the misallocation of resources we have due to greed. Greed is just individualizing a systemic issue. Good point. Very good point. I think greed is part of the problem, but of course the bigger issue is like the mode of capitalism that exists in society right now. So yeah, it's kind of like symptoms of a bigger problem. I think greed is like a symptom of a bigger problem, is the point. But yeah, you're definitely right. I definitely agree with you. I love Lindy's name, by the way. Lindy. Just in case you didn't know. Um, Yeah, this is facts. Lindy is spitting facts though. Start a moral firm and trying to reach even a moderate size without being boxed out by massive multinationals. That's 100% facts. Like you can't do anything good because the bigger companies, once it doesn't serve them, they're going to block you out and they're going to use money and influence and power to just block it every time, which is sad. It's sad that the world is that way, but that's just how things are. Watching these documentaries makes me feel like a communist, even though I'm very much not a communist. Be more on, they'll market your product as a threat to humanity. Yeah, this is true. You can't really expand without the bigger companies, and that's why all this like, and that's also why as a fashion journalist or as someone that works in fashion, I really value my ability to be independent, because the second that you start working way too closely with too many of these like massive corporations, you just lose yourself. I just feel like it's like inevitable. Alan says morality is extremely subjective. That's definitely true. In some cultures, what is considered moral in other cultures would be considered like normal. Sorry, would be considered crazy, um, or immoral. So no, that's true. Morality is definitely like subjective. Although it depends. It depends. It definitely depends. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.